we only have good things to say in this sense. Good message, right?
So
Okay, here we go.
can we, at the end, I've got a YouTube video to play.
Okay.
So can I
Play a YouTube video on a live stream YouTube. Let's see. Yeah, I'm gonna have to find out.
Okay.
Okay.
All right.
Can I get back?
That might be interesting. Yeah.
So
I'm pretty sure.
the box, I have to sit here just to move my.
It's just a link in the present. Where's control? Is that control?
The global climate is changing. How do we know? Because for over a century, meteorological stations have kept careful records of their weather observations. Until recently, they relied on pen and paper. Today, observations are automated and stored on supercomputers. They are combined with data from satellites and other high-tech instruments to produce forecasts. But long-term continuous observations from thermometers, rain gauges, and other traditional instruments remain essential. Without them, we could not be certain that the Earth has warmed by around 1 degree Celsius over the past century. But today, many of these historical records are at risk. Some measuring sites have been shut due to budget cuts. Others have been moved to a different location, and this makes long-term comparisons difficult. When an old observing station is closed, scientists lose an irreplaceable piece of the climate puzzle.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you very much for attending joint side event of the World Meteorological Organization with Global Climate Observing System and United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. The title of our side event is the Global Stocktake and Observing Networks, Indicators and Essential Climate Variables. My name is Amir Delju. I'm Senior Scientific Coordinator in Climate Prediction and Adaptation Branch of WMO. Today we will have 4 speakers. From the left, Dr. Florin Vladu. He's Manager of Adaptation Program in the United Nations Framework Convention. And Mr. Omar Baddour on my left. He's Chief of Climate Data Management in WMO. Dr. Simon Eggleston, he's Senior Scientific Officer from Global Climate Observing System in Geneva. And we have Mr. Stuard Goldstraw. He's Head of Observations and Operations from UK Met Office. Our first speaker is Dr. Florin Vladu. He has been with the United Nations since 1993. And he has been working with International Atomic Energy Agency for 7 years before joining UNFCCC. In UNFCCC, he's Manager of Science and Review Subprogram, which focuses on mainly observation. He's also focal point to IPCC. May I invite Florin? You please have your presentation.
Thank you, Amir. I will have the pleasure to talk today about the systematic observation under the UNFCCC, and I will try to focus a bit on the support which systematic observation can provide to the Paris Agreement. Yeah. The contents it's displayed on these slides. So I have 3 points: systematic observation, the UNFCCC, the Paris Agreement, and concluding remarks. As you know, systematic observation plays an essential role in tracking changes and understanding changes in the system, as well as projecting future changes. Yeah. For example, scientists can better track changes in land cover, ice sheets, and so on. People can see these changes with images from space. Decision makers could better understand and manage the disasters, and modelers can better project future. This systematic observation, nevertheless, has to be seen as the first step in a cycle, which is starting with systematic observation and ending with systematic observation with guidance received from a policy level. So while the landscape for systematic observation is quite complicated, I've tried to simplify it here, and I give you a couple of examples with GCOS and WMO. And information which is collected from systematic observation is processed by research programs such as WCRP, Future Earth, and sometimes used by Integrated Assessment Modeling Consortium. Yeah? From here you get various scenarios, for example, the scenarios of 1.5, 2 degrees, and shared socioeconomic pathways which are driving the assessments of IPCC, like the SIST assessment reports and the new special reports which should be prepared. And then these results goes here into the global stocktake. Of course, we have another branch here where climate services are used and information is produced, which could then end up in the substandard research dialogue or in the discussion on systematic observations. And this report should also inform the global stocktake. So it's a picture which is trying to put a bit of particulars on this cycle. From the policy level, you have continuously kind of guidance provided to all these steps. Yeah, and we have from GCOS directly from systematic observation things like climate vital signals, and you will hear talks about the climate indicators by Simmon later on, and we have the energy, water, carbon cycles presented. Now, our role, it's, as I said, mainly in the, and we, as you know, we have Substar and the COP. It's mainly in assessing needs, which are coming from GCOS, for example, and from parties, and providing advice. Yeah, the convention talks about the systematic observation, and this is the main reason why we have systematic observation and research on the agenda items. On this part, you have one player, which is GCOS and its sponsors, and then again this cycle, how they provide information to from WRCRP going towards UNFCCC. I have a slide which is quite complicated. I don't expect you to read it, but it's just trying to say what we have done. It's a summary of what we have done. As you know, our results are converted in decisions and conclusions, and you have here a list of decisions and conclusions which have been produced up to 2016 on this item. And you have here on the upper part the cycles of GCOS. And as you know, GCOS is looking at the providing guidance for maintaining an accurate set of information available, and it's a global guidance for all atmospheric, terrestrial, and oceanic domains. And they do that through assessing the needs and having this report, and then an implementation plan. And this we had several cycles. The last cycle is now, we have the implementation plan, which was prepared by GCOS and endorsed by the COP in 2016. Yeah. And in terms of future, I have again a complicated slide. We will probably see it on, if you look to the handout. We have tried to put here what IPCC will do next to the special reports and the R6, as well as others, in addition to GCOS. So that's giving us an idea on systematic observation, but you also look to climate services and science. So gives you a complex idea on what we did and what we plan to do and what our role is. Yeah. Now I'm shifting to the second topic of my talk, which is how systematic observation could help with the implementation of the Paris Agreement. And I have two slides about what is relatively new in the Paris Agreement, and as you know, this agreement is now founded. The mitigation action is founded on national action. Yeah, but in fact, on mitigation we will have a cycle which is composed of national action and international assessment. This international assessment of the action is called the global stocktake, which is not only for mitigation, but it's looking at the mitigation. Yeah, the temperature limit was changed. It's now well below 2 degrees towards 1.5, and then we have some political certainty by talking about mitigation goals in the near term, like peaking of emissions as soon as possible, as well as talking about the balance between emissions and anthropogenic emissions and removal by sinks in the second half of the century. Also, adaptation and loss and damage role. And loss and damage was not even discussed before, but even adaptation now role increased in the Paris Agreement, and there are many provisions on this. We have an enhanced transparency framework, which is cross-cutting and is looking to actions not only on mitigation, but also on adaptation and means of implementation. We call means of implementation financial support, technology and capacity building, technology transfer and capacity building. Yeah, and we have the global stocktake, which is, as I said, this international component of the cycle. Nationally determined action with internationally assessed progress. The global stocktake has been defined in the Paris Agreement, but not completely. I mean, we have the scope defined, and we have some elements of inputs. We have the outcome defined. In simple terms, it's a process like an input-output, where you have some inputs and then you do some processing. You have some outcomes. We even don't have the term outputs. We just have the outcome. And as you see, the information from IPCC is mentioned here, and the substar, but we're discussing currently other sources of information. We are discussing about taking stock, which should be comprehensive, mitigation, adaptation, and means of implementation. Assessing progress, which should be collective, not individual, for all countries. And then this should be done through a process which is facilitative, is not punitive, is not looking to finger point to any countries, and then the outcome is to update action and enhance action at the national level. So there is no international agreed target or something which has to be done. It's you go home and you update your NDC, and then enhancing international cooperation. And this is a process which is repeated every 5 years. Now, in particular, the Paris Agreement for systematic observation talks under the Article 7 on adaptation, on strengthening scientific knowledge on climate, including research, systematic observation of climate system and early warning system. And talks also about the climate services to inform decision makers. Now, work under the global stockade, it's ongoing, yeah? So we are not yet clear about the design, and this has to be finalized by the end of 2018, and this work happens under the APA here in Bonn, agenda item 6, yeah? But I have here a picture which gives you a bit of an idea what is expected to be done on adaptation. For example, on adaptation, we have 4 main activities. Review the overall progress in achieving the global goal on adaptation. So this has to be done at the international level, and there is a goal which is defined in the Article 7.1 of the Paris Agreement. We have to recognize the adaptation efforts of developing countries. We have to review the adequacy and effectiveness of adaptation action and support, and as a result of these 3 things, enhance the implementation of the adaptation action. To do this work, we are now designing modalities, how this could be done. So, and there are some specific mandates for the adaptation committee and the LEG to look to how this could be done, what kind of methodologies could be used. And there are inputs, like this line of inputs, which are information about the adaptation communication, which has to be stored into the registry and then communicated to global stock sales, or the enhanced transparency framework. In general, one could say this is information about what we plan to do, what countries plan to do, and this is information about what they have done. And also information could come from IPCC into the global stocktake. Now, what role the systematic observation can provide in such an architecture? I mean, on mitigation, it's a bit of future, I would say. I'm not talking about forestry and other things, but mitigation emissions. Yeah, there's a possibility to eventually monitor or measure the emissions as opposed to looking at the emissions through inventories. And this would allow for a better understanding of the carbon cycle, on attribution of greenhouse gases and things. Will support the transparency framework, will support the global stocktake. But this can be done from remote sensing as well as from airplanes or ground systems. So WMO has here a project which is ongoing, this IG3IS, which is trying to advance this part for mitigation. So it would maybe come in future, becoming very practical. There are some initial experiences with using the system for supporting the improvement of inventories or reducing uncertainties in the inventories, and countries like UK and Switzerland, and this now are used as examples and eventually scaled up. And then the next steps will be to enhance in the remote sensing systems which will do this. Yeah. For adaptations, we talk about climate indicators for decision making at national and subnational level, and as I said, Simon will speak a bit about this work by GCOS, improving early warning system, improve access to data for national adaptation plans and loss and damage planning. Yeah, and it's about the national and regional dimension of this information, and you would see, if you would go tomorrow to the research dialogue, you'll see what we are trying to do there to bring regional centers and we see that what WCRP is trying to do to have higher resolution modeling, which would provide results of greater relevance for these levels. And then you would see also what happens with understanding global weather phenomena like El Nino and La Nina. Climate services is also another part which where based on systematic observations, you can disseminate information in products which are, tailored for specific use, for specific sectors. And you would see also the research dialogue, some presentations on this. And here we are talking a lot about supporting the national adaptation plans. Yeah, this is some examples of regional information and how this temperature looks at the regional level in the Caribbean. Yeah? I will finish here with a few concluding remarks. So high quality observations are the foundation on solid decision makings, and I would highlight again some of these opportunities. One of them is, which we already worked on it, is to inform regularly the process on the state of the climate. So we have had this Earth Information Day for the first time last year in Marrakesh, and we have WMO now reporting to the COP every year on the state of the climate, and you would hear a presentation here about this. Another opportunity which I see is to liaise Beta, SABSTA, and other the implementation bodies with, we're trying to provide the information which is relevant for various work streams under the convention. And here we are trying now to matchmake the regional centers for climate with work which is done under the SABSTA and SPI with the national adaptation plans. And we are also trying to bring systematic observation and research to discussions on loss and damage, and slow onset events was one of the theme of the research dialogue last year. And I already talked about the possibility to improve the transparency framework for mitigation and improve national reporting. Now, indicators are coming again in the discussions, and then finally, it's about the technical examination process, where systematic observation was also mentioned. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Florin. Please let me notify that we will take questions in the end when all presentations are made. We will have interactive discussions. So I may invite next speaker, my colleague, Mr. Omar Baddour. He is Chief of Data Management Applications Division in WMO since 2005. He coordinates the WMO statement on the state of the global climate. He also coordinates international collaboration on data rescue and data management and development of data sets in support of climate monitoring and assessment. Omar, you have the floor, please.
Thank you, Amir. Good afternoon, good evening. I don't know what time is it now to say, but anyway, welcome. I am going to provide you an overview about the WMO statement on the state of the global climate. The statement on the state of the global climate is kind of a snapshot of information that WMO produce on annual basis to inform policymakers and the public at large on the state of the climate on annual basis. There are also specific reports that are produced by WMO on ad hoc basis. Those reports could be multi-year reports or reports that are dealing with specific extreme events which happen on large-scale domain. Today, in the context of SABSTA, I am making this presentation, and it has 4 elements. One, providing you historical background on the statement, and provide you some key findings which were produced for the 2016 statement, and then recent conclusions of a meeting of experts towards improving the WMO statement in the context of submissions to SABSTA and the stock taking, which is planned in 2023. And then a conclusion. As a background, the WMO statement actually started back in 1993 under the resolution of the WMO Congress. And the statement has been produced since then in 6 different languages, including the United Nations official languages. The statement is based on information that are assessed based on the GCOS essential climate variables, and thus it complements the long-term IPCC assessment reports, which are produced on basically 5 to 6 years time cycle. The statement is composed of information that are provided by the National Meteorological and Hydrological Services, which operate observation networks under the mandate of WMO, but also from international agencies and international climate centers and climate data analysis. At COP22, as Florin explained, WMO was invited by SABSTA to produce or to submit its statement to the SABSTA as appropriate. This is a snapshot of the WMO statement for 2016. As you can see, those are the 4 key conclusions in the report. It's about 15 pages, and it covers many other aspects, but I would like just to highlight those aspects that are more global of nature and that interest policymakers. First of all, the warming continued in 2016, and now we are reached 1.1 degrees centigrade compared to pre-industrial period. And the global sea ice extent, which is an evident signal of climate change, dropped more than 4 million square kilometers below average. And carbon dioxide concentration reached the record 400 parts per million for the first time. And also the climate variability played also an important role in explaining the record breaking of temperature because of the strong 2015-2016 El Nino event. As a matter of fact, this chart provides you the global temperature anomaly compared to the average of 6190, which is WMO reference period. And the red bars are those years where we observed El Nino events, and blue ones are where we observed La Nina events, which are the cooling of the tropical central equatorial Pacific. And the yellow one are neutral, considered neutral, which means that the Pacific was at normal conditions. And there are some gray bars where we have some volcanoes. So as you can see, El Nino usually boosts the temperature globally. And there was an assessment that this boosting is around 0.1 to 0.2 degrees centigrade compared to the average background trend. So in addition to the global temperature warming trend, there is from time to time an influence from the Pacific Ocean or from other drivers that make the temperature is not on steady line, but from ups and downs, depending on whether we are in Nino, La Nina, or other driver. The statement is progressively including information on climate impact on social and economic condition of the people. 2015-2016 was characterized by a severe drought which affected a large portion of Southern Africa and East Africa. And actually it led to a collaboration with many UN agencies to get information. And one of the key information that millions of people were displaced, either internally or through international immigration because of the dryness. And that was caused mainly in Africa, Southern Africa, by El Nino event. El Nino also played a role in explaining one of the strongest sea level rise that we observed in recent years. As you can see at the end of this time series, there is a jump in the sea level rise above of the long-term trend increase. So this is a snapshot of what happened in 2016. Now, in the context of Substa and global stock taking, WMO is working with programs, GCOS, WCRP, and others, as well as United Nations agencies to improve the methodology, the data, the indicators that we are based on, and also address some open science issues, attribution of extremes, whether they are linked to climate change or to regional climate drivers like ENSO, El Nino, and also how to address informational impacts, which is very important for decision making. This map shows the logos of the international organization which were present at the expert meeting, which was held in February. 28 experts from 15 agencies and international programs actually attended that meeting. And now I am going through some of the key findings from this meeting. One on methodology and data. One of the issues is the baselines that we use to compare the current climate with the past. Temperature and greenhouse gas concentration in the atmosphere can be compared to pre-industrial period, but some of the variables cannot because of the lack of the data. And also some emerging data sets coming from satellite or from reanalysis data belongs to more recent period from 1980 to now. And so there was an indication that we have to use this new emerging data, which now cover more than 30 years period, for providing information on the state of the climate, especially from satellite, which cover more space than the current observing networks that WMO manage, and also reanalysis, which combines data from observation and data from models, which are very powerful in covering areas like the polar area. On precipitation, it's very important because it's a parameter that links between global warming and what happens on the water aspect in terms of water resources, in terms of flooding, extreme events like these. So there is some work which has been done in the past years by a joint work between WMO, WCRP, and JCOM, is Joint Commission of Marine Meteorology, to develop some indices based on observation. But also now they are expanding to use also model data to produce these indices. And it was thought that using these indices globally and making statistics from them can be very important, very useful to the stock taking on precipitation. Also, tropical cyclone activity, which is very important to explain a huge impact on population, has been also discussed, despite there is some discrepancy in the or harmonization of the data on tropical cyclones. There is what is called accumulated cyclone energy, which can be used also to inform globally on this activity. Climate indicators, Florin mentioned this, before me. It's very important because policymakers are not interested in going into very detailed description of what happened. So we are trying to work closely with stakeholders and with major programs like WMO, like WCRP and GCOS, to define a minimum set of indicators that can inform more deeply on the climate system, more coherently, but in simplistic way and with the due relevancy. We are working on many aspects, on the cryosphere, on the atmosphere, and on extreme events. And we need now to come up with a synthesis of the work that we are doing with these groups. And there have been workshops organized by the GCOS, and it was very useful to list some of these indicators, but we have not come yet to the conclusions which indicator we need to put on the table. Open science issues, in many cases, WMO statements on the climate refers to some results that are still experimental in nature. And it was discussed how we should present this information on things that are not yet robustly determined. They are very useful for scientists, but they are also very useful for policymakers, but there are always some doubts to convey a correct message. So it was, for example, the Southern Ocean cooling, which has been observed in past years. What is the cause of this Southern Ocean cooling? Is it due to the lack of a network, observation network, or it's physically explained? And if it's so, what is the current explanation? So it was decided that it was recommended that WMO statement should inform on these open science issues with due caution that these science issues are still under study and should be confirmed. But a sidebar on this kind of open science issue was recommended to be useful to update on annual basis. And WCRP is going to lead on these open science issues and produce a kind of sidebar for the WMO statement. There are so many other open science issues like the glaciers, the melting of the glaciers, the permafrost, and the Antarctic sea ice, which is behaving differently from the Arctic sea ice. So all these open science issues are very relevant to climate studies, but need to be addressed very cautiously in proper manner. Attribution of extremes, sometimes an extreme, we don't know whether it's due to climate change, it's due to climate variability, it's due to both. And there are some very progressing work on the attribution science. But still, the science of attribution of extremes has not matured enough to make a robust science. So therefore, there was a discussion on this, and now it's going to be part of the WMO statement, but as part of multi-year kind of assessment, not on annual basis. An example of the attribution which was done at national level and which was published in the WMO statement in 2014, the UK annual record temperature in 2014 was assessed to be human influenced by human activities, and that 2014, sorry, it's 2014, not 2015, the influence of human activity was about 10 times more likely than without human activities. So this is very important information for policymakers, for science progress, and we need to expand on that to other kind of extremes. For example, this is a map of some extremes that WMO has published in collaboration with NOAA in the United States, of many kind of extremes such as heat waves, flooding, extreme precipitation, and tropical cyclones, which caused damages to the population. So we need to cover globally the attribution aspect of this event to man-made climate change or to purely natural climate variability. Informational impact, of course, policymakers are very interested in connecting climate extremes and climate change to tangible risks for the population, including displacement, which mobilize a lot of resources and induce governmental implications. So it's very important. It was recommended that this information is very important to produce on an annual basis. Therefore, it was recommended that the WMO statement will be divided in two strands, one on the physical aspects like temperature, cryosphere, etc., and one on informational impact. WMO does not have a mandate to collect informational impact, but it can partner with UN agencies to have this information from authoritative source. And this is what is going to happen. As a conclusion, so global warming still continues since the fifth assessment report, of course, and it's fitting well with the statement from IPCC that the warming of the climate system is unequivocal, and it's evident that from observation records and from ocean temperature, widespread melting, and snow and ice, and rising global average of sea level. Also, we have 2015, 2016, one of the powerful El Nino that we have recorded so far. It had a large impact on socioeconomic issues and population. WMO will continue to submit its information on state of the climate to the UNFCCC, and we are preparing WMO statement to be part of the submissions to the stocktake. And somehow we need to discuss this with IPCC, how to communicate this information in coherent manner. Also, on climate indicators, which is going to be one of the key outcomes of the collaboration with GCOS and WCFP, is going on, and GCOS is leading some efforts on this, and we are working closely to come up with a list of these indicators. Of course, the WMO statement is being renovated, and we hope that it will be ready for the next year. At least a portion of the recommendation should be implemented by next year, so that the statement on 2017 will carry out some of this improvement. But the full improvement has to be done in over several years, and we hope that will be by the 2023, the date of the implementation of the start of the stocktake WMO statement will be fully ready to produce useful information for policymakers. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Omar, for showing us very nice examples on how we can draw scientific facts from data. So our next speaker is Dr. Simmon Eggleston. Simmon is Senior Scientific Officer in Global Climate Observing System. He has already been working with a group of Earth observations, GEO and IPCC, but he can give more details about himself. Thank you, Simmon. You have the floor.
energy conservation, ocean warming, sea level rise. We're also looking at the biosphere, changes in our Antarctic sea ice, and snow and ice cover. We also need to look at extremes and how they may be changing. Heat waves, extreme precipitation, and droughts. And here we can identify parameters based upon centaurs and how these extremes affect. Finally, though we haven't actually achieved it yet, we would like some indicator of change in the biosphere. One suggestion has been some sort of indicator of greening, but we're still thinking about that. It's an area that becomes very useful. Maybe to put these things into context, the global carbon budget. These are data actually coming from the global carbon budget. 16. But the emissions, anthropogenic sources of CO2, in two major categories, sourced from fossil fuel and cement, the majority of it, and some from emissions from land use. And this carbon is emitted to the atmosphere, partition various sinks. Some is taken up by the ocean, some by the land, and the remainder stays in the atmosphere. These are the climate change. We have a number of ECVs that are monitoring all of these different parts of the cycle. So if you look at the sinks, for example, the ECVs measuring the ocean carbonate system, estimate the ocean, measures the atmospheric concentrations of greenhouse gases. For the land sink, that is usually estimated as the remainder when you take away the other sinks from the emissions. But we do have a number of ECVs that components of that land sink. These are being measured over time, and we can understand how these are changing. So you see there's been a large increase in emissions. Fossil fuel, cement, land use change emissions are constant behind it. And the three sinks so far are increasing. It's worth also remembering that these sinks have their own impacts beyond the ocean uptakes of acidity. The land sink, global greening, CO2 fertilization, these have continued. We can look at the energy flows, the energy imbalance, the difference between what's received from the sun and what's being emitted from space that's provided by the climate. And it's a small imbalance compared to the solar radiation. It's a large amount of energy. It's worth saying that actually of this energy, most of it is absorbed. Only about 1% goes into the atmosphere. Some goes to warming the land and make plants. The vast majority, 90%. That warming in the oceans contributes to sea level rise, but actually it only contributes to over a third of sea level rise so far. About half of the rise is due to melting. And another fraction is due to changes in the cycle of land. Again, this is a case to understand the sea level rise. We also need to be able to understand the whole range of parameters of the land. Ice, to understand the full cycle. Be able to predict. An important part of observations is actually people using the data. People aren't able to access them when really the whole observation system is. That's why data access, data stewardship, plans, and what we're advocating for. Open data policies, people access, discover the data. Standards so that people can identify with the data and how it's produced. certainly a lot of efforts on data rescue, a lot of data made in the past, preparing away on old paper records and the like. Activities to actually cover that data, digitize it, we're able to fill gaps in the past. Climate observations, as I said, underpin climate services through being able to forecast protection possible, understanding risks. However, a lot of the climate services, planning for things like adaptation, are very local impacts, and the priorities that different places will put upon them vary. Whether it's something food production, agriculture, that's infrastructure, sea level rise, health, heat waves, and so forth. So these are very widely. So GCOS is also putting together some regional activity. The implementation plan itself does allow for the provision of the amount of information locally. Some of this is observations by global networks. There's also downscaling model data, the analysis products. But there are also local needs for observations, and we're planning on starting a series of regional workshops to actually try and identify these needs and potentially also identify other sources of. There's a part of the GCOS called the GCOS Cooperation Mechanism Fund that has been providing support to companies observing systems, very practical support, some equipment, providing training, providing communication skills, and so forth. And we would like to strengthen, especially to fill gaps in parts of the world where we're. So to summarize, sound climate policies are underpinned by observation. Climate observation must be sustained over the long term and stable. The global climate system that we have is the result of many independent markets. Focusing on the interconnected climate cycles of carbon, water, and energy, we understand data stewardship is vital. Open access to data discoverability, enable the data to use, very practical. To support adaptation, GCOS will need to understand local needs, therefore will develop regional plans and focus. Finally, a core set of indicators can be produced for policy development on communicating the state of play.
Thank you very much, Simon. I realize how observation is complex and how broad are data types and how difficult it is to produce climate products. So our next speaker is Mr. Stuard Goldstraw. He is Head of Observations Operations at the Met Office of UK, with responsibility for all their operational synoptic and climatic networks. Within WMO, he is the chair of the Commission for Basic Systems expert team on surface-based observing and the chair of the WMO Integrated Global Observing System task team on data quality monitoring systems. Stuart, you have the floor. Thank you.
Can you hear me if I stand? That's the important thing. Can you hear me at the back? Yep, brilliant. All right, thank you very much. I'm going to stand. So we've heard about policy. We've heard about significant efforts to summarize the state of the climate, and we've heard about the very ambitious program that GCOS has to ensure that we've got that information and we've got it in a consistent manner. I'm going to do a very short presentation at the end, you'll be pleased to know, about a very, very simple initiative, in many ways a very small initiative, but actually if we don't get it right, we might start to see one of the basic building blocks crumble. and this is recognizing Centennial Stations. So my presentation really consists of 5 bits. 4 of the bits will work. One of the components also, I've been informed, will also work, which is fantastic. Thank you very much to the technical support team. So normally I would have lots of pictures in my presentations. I've got very few pictures in my presentations because I'm promising you a video with some moving pictures at the end. But I want to just give you the background, to put context of why Centennial Stations, or why the Centennial Station Initiative is important, to give you an update on the progress we've made to date, just highlight the assessment criteria we're using, which hopefully will underline why what Simon and our other speakers today have said is so important, because if we don't get this right, we don't have the basic evidence base. Then I'll just update you on where we are with the nominations and the review of those nominations. And quite literally this week, those nominations will cease being nominations and be stamped and approved, or we certainly hope. And then we have the video. Okay, I'm going to use the term Centennial Stations and long-term observing stations almost interchangeably. Please forgive me, I like the badge Centennial Stations, but it is a flawed naming convention. And it is flawed because I don't know what we're going to do in another 100 years when we end up with a 200-year program. So please forgive me. But when I make this sort of presentation, I tend to have 2 types of response from the audience. So the first type of response is, this could be quite interesting. I'll see it out. Let's see where it goes. It's quite a positive, quite an alpha response. And then we have the omega response. Oh no, not Centennial Stations again. Hopefully there's some form of distribution of interest in the room, and we're not all in either one camp or the other, but it's my job to try and interest you and excite you about the Centennial Stations. So why are we doing this? Well, we've heard a lot from the 3 other presenters about the importance of observations. And I think when we look in WMO, within the World Meteorological Organization's guidance and regulatory material, as a UN agency, it's excellent at producing lots of guidance and regulatory material, but there aren't a lot of references which talk about maintaining very long-term stations. We tend to talk about the 30-year record being a minimum requirement, but we don't tend to go very much beyond that because we are relatively conservative as a community. You know, we don't want to make the challenge too great for people, but actually those long-term records are really important. So we have this gap. There's a single bullet point here. I'll try to distill this down into a very, very simple statement, but hopefully you can all see what it means without me maybe making too big a deal about it. Decision makers have a lot of priorities that they have to balance, and it's quite hard making the business case to establish a station today that will still be operating in 100 years' time. Therefore, we are thankful for those people who had that vision 100 years ago to establish stations that are still operating today, and so we can use that information. And then the last driver behind this is that there was a feeling there's a certain level of burning deck. There are pressures on observing sites, and being able to recognize them, being able in some way to badge them will hopefully protect them in the future, because this is not just about the last 100 years. It's about continuing these sites into the future. Okay, so as with any initiative, there are always the giants upon whose shoulders we're standing. And in this case, I would have to say that Inga and Michelle were fantastic in starting this piece of work off, along with our colleagues in the WMO Secretariat. They had this vision. They recognized something important needed to be solved, and they were the ones that were brave enough to put pen to paper. Of course, when you do that, you've then got to take that initial idea and turn it into something robust. And the next stage we went through is bring a multidiscipline grouping together, so that it wasn't just climatologists, it wasn't just operational managers, it wasn't just experts in observing systems. It was a whole range of individuals with different backgrounds and different perspectives on the challenge. And that was really important for us. We then, within WMO, had 3 of our technical commissions review the proposal, review the assessment criteria and refine it and improve it. We went to them for expert opinion. They gave us expert opinion, and we revised the assessment criteria. And we've essentially ended up, which is quite topsy-turvy, but with 9 mandatory assessment criteria and 3 desirable criteria. And the 3 desirable criteria are only not mandatory because of the nature of them in their very essence. But in parallel to doing all this, we also had to actually test the idea in the first place. There's no point in establishing a series of criteria if you then find out no single site in the whole of the world will comply to it, and therefore you don't have a capability that you can badge and save. So we did a certain amount of unofficial testing before we gained approval from the WMO Congress, which is the highest decision-making body within WMO. So we really had the support of what I would say is the genuine top-level leadership within WMO for this proposal. So it's down to the great work of Inga and Michelle and the Secretariat to get us to where we were, with the progressive and increased support of everybody else becoming involved as they realize the importance. Okay, so the 9 mandatory assessment criteria, I don't want to sort of go into this in too much detail in terms of the speed, but the second point actually was a point of debate which we really needed to get to. When we talk about a 100-year record, as we are all aware, there have been many, many issues over the last 100 years that may have led to continuous climate records not being in existence. During our meeting, we had a colleague from West Africa who was clearly making the case that while the Ebola outbreak was going on in his country, that was far more important than continuing to make climate measurements. So we have to recognize that sort of big impact. And also we had a colleague from Hong Kong, China. Hong Kong Observatory is one of the nominated stations, and it's understandable that between 1941 and 1945 there perhaps wasn't a continuous record. And so there's a whole host of drivers why it's very hard to identify genuinely continuous records. So we had to put some form of criteria in with also some caveats. Otherwise there'll be a lot of stations falling by the wayside, not getting the badging, and therefore by implication not getting the protection. So again, I'll put the next 4 up. 2 sets of 4 makes 8. It doesn't make 9 because the 9th essential criteria is thou shalt strive to ensure you continue to follow the previous 8. This is not a do and forget. This is a do and remain committed. And so just because a station is reporting today and may get badged today, there is actually part of the process to remove that badging, remove that positive credit association for long-term record if you fail to continue to comply with the mandatory conditions. And even that was quite a contentious discussion within WMO. We're a very sort of warm and close family, and we don't like telling people they're doing things wrong. But if we want to succeed, we have to have some way of making this assessment mean something. And then we have our desirable criteria, and we heard from Simon the vital importance about access to the data. It's actually not just the observational data, it's the metadata. And whilst we have some really good regulations about making the data available, access to the metadata, as any climate scientist will tell you, is essential to interpreting that data correctly. And so all these desirable criteria weren't mandatory for many good reasons in the background. But this is our drive and ambition throughout the whole of WMO from an observational point of view. If we're making the observation, let's make not only the observational data available, but all the ancillary data as well. And that's a sort of underpinning mantra that we have. So why are assessment criteria important? Well, I get to do a name and shame. Although you'd be pleased to know I do a name and shame to myself. So this is a picture of Leeuwik Observatory in 1965. It's a long way away. If I had a laser pointer, I could highlight the location on the screen. Because I'm stood up, I can come over here. And even those at the back, trust me that here is the observatory building and the observing enclosure right in the middle. And although there are some buildings behind, that is a generally open landscape. We move forward to 2003, which is 38 years later. Yes, that adds up. Brilliant. And we've zoomed in a little bit, but essentially the message here is the environment had not fundamentally changed. Some of the instrumentation we're using is changed. We've captured that in the metadata. We're making that available to people to tell them that it's the observations can be considered in the context of the local changes in the measurement methods, but the location is essentially the same. Unfortunately, on my watch, while I was responsible and in charge, I allowed that building to be built, which is the new observatory. And you will note, if we do, you will note this block here is this same block here. So what I've done is essentially do a very mini version of urban encroachment. And I've impacted on that location, which means that this particular location, which I'm particularly proud of, may not get badged when it comes to its 100-year cycle, because I've been responsible for impacting on the local conditions. So all of us have to be careful with any changes we're implementing. That's why it's important. Okay, so we have a nomination process which is underway. And it's underway in so much that we ask the members of WMO to provide us with stations that they would like to nominate, that they felt met the criteria. We had an independent panel drawn from climatologists, instrument specialists, operational service providers, and the GCOS Secretariat to assess those applications. And of the 86 applications, 60 were deemed to be sufficient to start with questions, caveats over the other 26. Most of those caveats are around, do you have solid plans to make that data available? And that's about feeding back. So that's not a rejection, that's just not yet a positive response. But we're making good progress. And this will either be an annual or biannual call. It'll be a function of the resources we have available. This is not the end. This could be argued to be the end of the beginning, in that we've got the first run through. And by Friday, we hope that the WMO Executive Council, which is a sort of subsidiary body of Congress, will give approval to those 60 stations and will charge the team with continuing to search out and identify the Centennial Stations so that hopefully they can be secured for the future. So there were a lot of words without very many pictures. So I'm very hopeful now, with a bit of magic, I can stop talking and
The global climate is changing. How do we know? Because for over a century, meteorological stations have kept careful records of their weather observations. Until recently, they relied on pen and paper.
So technology may have defeated me personally, and I apologize. But what I would say is, please go to the link.
Okay, yeah, so
Please view that video.
I'm sorry, it's because it was a technical.
That's
yeah,
fine.
so you can find on the website the live streaming.
Brilliant.
The video will be there.
Brilliant. Thank you very much for sorting
It will
that.
be
That's very
on
much appreciated.
UNFCCC Newsroom Live YouTube events. So all presentations, including this video clip, will be there. You can find it.
Okay, and that's it. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you very
for your
much,
time.
Stuart. So we had a very nice range of presentations showing the value of systematic observations in the context of United Nations framework, in the context of Paris Agreement, the expectations from parties. We had an example from WMO submission, like statement on the status of global climate. We had presentation from GCOS that showed us the complexity of observation, how disciplines and order GCOS has brought to this network. And we had nice presentation from Stuart showing the value of Centennial Stations and the legacy of the past scientists how their work will be used for the future and will remain for the future. So in this segment of the side event, we will have interactive discussions. Fortunately, we are quite on time, and we had expected to have 20 minutes interactive discussion, so we are exactly on the same timeline. I would like to open the floor for your questions, and depending on the area of each speaker, they will make clarification and respond. We have a catch box that I should throw at you, but I bring. And throw to the next.
Okay, yeah, we're still in a fairly early stage of planning. We're hoping to start doing them maybe very early next year. Our initial thoughts are that we would start off perhaps something around water issues, so precipitation, droughts, that sort of area, and focusing certainly in the developing world. I mean, I'm not sure there'll be so much need for these workshops in the developed world. We have been toying with the idea of looking at some of the small island states as a starting point. There's also a big need for Africa, in parts of Africa where the big observational gaps. But we'll know more as we develop that idea more, and we're hoping to collaborate with the convention and interested parties, so that will help build it up.
Thanks, Simon. Yeah, we have another question from back of the room. Yeah. Okay. Thank you. Introduce yourself. All those who have questions, please introduce yourself. Thank you.
Introduce yourself. Okay. Mona Abdelhafiz Zolbeit, Sudan. Yes, I'm interested in the data for this observation to surfaces for adaptation. So I don't know the scenarios that will be, especially in the developing countries or the developing countries.
Okay. First of all, about the biosphere indicator. The process we followed so far was talking. We had a meeting amongst between ourselves and some interested parties in Geneva with a few other organisations to try and get some ideas together. But I think those were all people already deeply involved in those sort of observations with the cryosphere and the atmosphere. For this biosphere thing, I think we obviously need to think more widely. GCOS has a panel, TOPSY, the Terrestrial Observations for Climate panel, and they had some discussions about it, but they weren't conclusive. So at the moment, we're not quite sure where to go. We have there has been some suggestions that something like leaf area index would be an interesting parameter to use because it can be monitored globally from satellites, and certainly the trends that have been produced do seem to indicate it's useful. Perhaps one way forward might be, but we're looking at starting a process of reviewing the ECVs over the next 3-4 years, because we'll need to produce an update to our implementation plan in maybe 5 years' time. And we'd like to try and involve as many people as broadly in different communities as possible in that process. And we will be inviting comments and suggestions in a sort of public process to do that. And maybe that might be a way to get more ideas on how such an indicator could be developed. But I think we do need to get as many ideas out there as possible into this process, partly because there are good ideas out there that we're not aware of, and partly I think it would give it much broader acceptance. As for sort of information for adaptation, it seems clear that if you're thinking about adapting to climate change, you need some idea of how the changes are going and what are the likely impacts to be. And I think that's why in the past we have held apparently regional workshops in the past that did produce plans to fill gaps that were seen as important in different regions, but those plans were never actually enacted, built upon. So if we do, as we go down this road, we'll need to try and work out how we can try and ensure that action is actually taken on those plans, that something is done about them. Because if we can identify observational gaps that would tell people useful things about how the climate is changing, then obviously we want to see people actually acting on that and filling those gaps. And how that is done, I don't know. I mean, it might be more observations. It might, on the ground, in some cases, it might be encouraging more satellite observations, which I know are now being used at fairly high resolution for forest monitoring, for example. It may be looking at reanalysis projects, reanalysis outputs and downscaling to actually fill gaps using models, really. But however that's done will be an output from these workshops. But obviously part of that does need to be a plan on how you actually get real action rather than people just talking about it.
Thank you, Simon. The last question also reminds me of GCOS UNFCCC workshop that was held, I guess, last year or two years ago on observation requirements for adaptation. The report of that workshop also includes nice guidelines and also key points that can be used by delegates who have similar questions. They are both on UNFCCC and WMO web pages. Any further question from the floor? Yes, Turkey. Mesut, please.
I assume you're talking about emissions and of CO2. Emissions, people producing. Yeah. No, I don't think that's the responsibility of the meteorological officers. I mean, many countries have their own organizations, their own bodies responsible for estimating emissions already. And I mean, nothing I say or nothing GCOS says would change that, or would even intend to change that. I think what we're doing by including that is twofold. I mean, the first is we realize this is a very important parameter, and we're trying to encourage more reporting and some more consistency in reporting. And the second one is we've heard there have been suggestions, we heard from Florian about moves towards measuring or estimating emission fluxes through based on satellite measurements and concentration measurements and inverse modeling approaches. And again, if those come to fruition, then there needs to be some idea on what sort of levels of accuracy and scale people need to achieve through those. So again, that's why those parameters are there. But as I said, I mean, every country has their own organizations already estimating those fluxes, and we've no intent or idea to change that.
Integrated greenhouse gas monitoring system.
Yeah. Okay. I mean, I think a system like that, it's obviously in early stage and being developed. I think I would see it certainly in the foreseeable future as being more along the lines of validation, that it provides independent validation of the inventory type estimates. I think the inventory estimates can be quite good, but the one thing about them is it's very difficult to have some sort of independent check. And that's what these sort of satellite-based or ground-based measurements can provide, is sort of some sort of assurance that these numbers are reasonable and roughly right. And I mean, there have been examples of people using these sort of methods, especially with some of the fluorinated gases where there aren't natural sources, to identify that whether sources were missing. So I would see it more as a sort of validation and confirmation process, certainly in the foreseeable future.
The short answer is I agree. Of all the information I didn't put up, part of the other part of the purpose of the Centennial Station initiative is not just to secure their long-term future, but that for them to act as a beacon on best practice. And then one of those points of best practice is any technological changes we introduce. If we identify locations where we can compare the old and new, we have a long-term record. So short answer is I agree.
Thank you, Stuart. We have another question from Nigeria. I think this will be the last question because we should make the room available to next organizers of the event.
Certainly in the first batch, there were a number of stations from Region 1, so that's the African continent region, and we believe there will be others. But you're right, this is a particular challenge where resources are limited in the first place. And so this is really where we hope that this initiative will help the most. Because once these stations are gone, they're gone forever. And so if the badging in some way helps convince the funding bodies that they will continue to fund that location or protect it in some way, that would be truly fantastic, whether that funding body be a government organization or a non-government organization.
Thank you very much to all speakers, presenters to the side event, and thank you to all of you who showed your interest and attended in this meeting. Please note that we will post the presentations on the web by tomorrow morning, and you can also go to unfccc.newsroom/live/YouTube events to access again to all those presentations plus video clip, which was not played on the screen here. Thank you very much.
The global climate is changing. How do we know? Because for over a century, meteorological stations have kept careful records of their weather observations. Until recently, they relied on pen and paper. Today, observations are automated and stored on supercomputers. They are combined with data from satellites and other high-tech instruments to produce forecasts. But long-term continuous observations from thermometers, rain gauges, and other traditional instruments remain essential. Without them, we could not be certain that the Earth has warmed by around 1 degree Celsius over the past century. But today, many of these historical records are at risk. Some measuring sites have been shut due to budget cuts. Others have been moved to a different location, and this makes long-term comparisons difficult. The global climate is changing. How do we know? Because for over a century, meteorological stations have kept careful records of their weather observations. Until recently, they relied on pen and paper. Today, observations are automated and stored on supercomputers. They are combined with data from satellites and other high-tech instruments to produce forecasts. But long-term continuous observations from thermometers, rain gauges, and other traditional instruments remain essential. Without them, we could not be certain that the Earth has warmed by around 1 degree Celsius over the past century. But today, many of these historical records are at risk. Some measuring sites have been shut due to budget cuts. Others have been moved to a different location, and this makes long-term comparisons difficult. When an old observing station is closed, scientists lose an irreplaceable piece of the climate puzzle.
These very long-term measurements, like this one, which is extending back to 18th century, they are highly valuable for understanding what has been this natural climate variability. These measurements are highly important. They are the backbone of both weather forecasting and they are also the backbone of climate science, atmospheric sciences. And it's highly important that we ensure the long-term sustainability of these measurements.
Stations with 100 years or more of continuous measurements can tell a unique story about our recent climate history. This is why the World Meteorological Organization is inviting governments to nominate such stations for formal recognition as Centennial Observing Stations. On top of their scientific value, many Centennial Observing Stations are also of outstanding historical and cultural interest. They recall a previous era and the birth of modern meteorology. The Moncalieri Observatory, outside Turin, Italy, has a long and uninterrupted record of measurements. Moncalieri was established in 1859. Luca Mercalli is the president of the Italian Meteorological Society.
In questo osservatorio Francesco Denza fondò la Società Meteorologica Italiana e guidò la nascita della prima rete nazionale di stazioni meteorologiche dalle Alpi alla Sicilia. Alcuni strumenti non sono più in servizio, ma raccontano la storia della meteorologia. Questo anemoietografo, costruito nella seconda metà dell'Ottocento, misurava vento e precipitazioni. È uno dei pochi esemplari ancora esistenti. Questa è la capannina meteorologica di Stevenson. Qui sono ospitati i sensori di temperatura e umidità che operano nelle stesse condizioni di oltre un secolo fa, per mantenere la confrontabilità della serie storica. Sono regolarmente tarati con l'Istituto Nazionale di Metrologia e il progetto Meteomet.
The UN Climate Change Convention recognizes that climate policy must be based on sound climate science. Climate science, in turn, depends on robust observations. Centennial observing stations are therefore a vital resource for current and future generations.
Governments have adopted the Paris Agreement, which is very good news for the atmosphere. But we have to also follow what is happening in atmosphere based on these measurements. And WMO and its members are happy to provide this information for decision makers.